and I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about a topic that is near and dear to the hearts of many organizations that are looking to gain the benefits of going social, but are concerned about the limitations imposed by compliance challenges that they must face at the same time. We're going to spend about 30 to 40 minutes going through some practical experience that OpenQ has had and some practical advice that we have for organizations that are in the early or mid stages of their social journey, with a particular emphasis about compliance priorities. Our hope is that if you do have questions over the course of the presentation, feel free to submit them via the chat window in the GoToMeeting pane on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll also provide a copy of the document that we share today after this presentation, and look forward to ongoing discussions with you regarding the intersection of social and compliance. So let's talk a little bit about today's agenda. We're going to go through 4 different topics. First, we'll set up the discussion and go through a short introduction. And secondly, we'll talk a little bit about the power and risk of social and making the business case for social, and why risk and compliance have entered the picture in such a major way to, in many cases, limit or completely eliminate the company's perception of their access to social technology. Then we're going to spend time talking about some practical advice for companies that are engaging are looking to deploy an internal social or collaboration platform, and we'll break that down into different individual functional components, if you will. And then the last thing that we'll do today is we'll spend some time looking into the future and talking about some of the trends that will be shaping social and compliance over the next number of years, and what will be the implications for those trends for companies who are just now starting to adopt internal social collaboration or social platforms. So we'll try to accomplish that, as I mentioned, in the next 30 to 40 minutes. We're happy to, again, encourage questions both at the end as well as along the way. If I see a question come in the question pane, I'll do my best to pause at that moment to try to answer it in time. So let's talk a little bit about the introduction. And first, I'd like to introduce OpenQ. OpenQ as an organization provides solutions that enable companies and regulated industries to successfully connect to social networks, whether those be internal social networks or external social networks. When we excel, we are helping companies who believe that they're being limited from social activity for compliance reasons, that they're able to overcome those challenges and be able to seize the benefits of social business. As we are a social company unto ourselves, we have a long-term commitment to meeting the compliance needs of the regulated industries that we serve within healthcare, life sciences, financial services, retail, and consumer goods. We're also a frequent advocate and member of the discussion in the dialogue that goes on in the social world around social and compliance. And finally, we're a product company, so we believe that we can bring products to market that solve the common sense compliance needs of organizations that are looking to go social. I also want to add in the process that the information and guidance that I'm presenting today is based on OpenQ's experience in the space and not based on any particular legal basis. I'm not an attorney, just as a disclaimer. So we've tried to make our advice and guidance to individuals today as practical and oriented as possible. One of the other areas I wanted to highlight in introducing the discussion today is the breakout of the social compliance challenge, and we'll talk about this from a number of different angles. But as OpenQ approaches the market, we break down the challenges that we try to solve for companies into 4 different buckets. Companies who are looking to engage public social, such as Facebook and Twitter, and how to do that in a compliant way. Companies who are looking to have compliant internal collaboration platforms. Companies who are looking to have an extended enterprise approach to social with partners and customers and the like, and want to have a private social community where they're controlling the risks associated with that. Or companies who are looking at any of the 3 items above from a perspective of identifying and managing not only current but potential future and predictive risk. As I mentioned, OpenQ is a product organization, And so we're focused on delivering great products that are used by compliance professionals and operational professionals across multiple industries. So let's talk a little bit about the business opportunity and the business challenge associated with adopting internal social platforms. And let me start with a thought experiment, which is envision your organization and your organization's top line. Take about 10% of the value of that top line and envision that that amount of money is sitting in the form of a check in front of you. And the challenge of organizations looking to go social, or the opportunity, if you will, is to seize that check, which is there's a lot of good indications that companies who are able to make a social transformation are able to achieve substantial top-line growth for their organization. The recent McKinsey study, which I've excerpted on this page here, points to a $1.3 trillion economic impact that's possible through the social business transformation, which roughly translates to about a 10% top-line growth. So how do organizations go about seizing that check? Well, one of the values of social business is that a social transformation isn't something that just takes place within one part of an organization, but it's truly a transformation that can take place across functional groups. So when an organization adopts an internal social platform, it's not just about marketing or just about sales or about research and development. It's truly a transformation that can take place on an enterprise-wide basis. That's one of the reasons why the value and the impact can be so profound. Now, at the same time, when we think about social business, one of the things that we like to do is look at social business through the lens of history, which is to understand where we are today as companies are adopting internal social collaboration platforms like Chatter and Yammer. You need to understand that that is a result of a growth of a technology trend that's been underway since the 1980s, where organizations have looked over time for different types of tools that will help companies, individuals within companies and cross-functional groups more effectively collaborate. So as we think about the rise and adoption of internal social platforms, we think of it as something that's arisen from a trend of collaboration computing, which has been taking place over many, many years. And we also think about it within the context of just one of the many different aspects associated with the adoption of social business. So when you become a social organization, it's not just about your internal social platform, it's your extended enterprise social, it's also about your public social. And all of that transformation is what comes together to get those tremendous benefits that the McKinsey study talks about. Now, let's go back to that thought experiment, and again, envision that 10% value check in front of you, and you're trying to seize that for your organization. What's ultimately holding you back as a company? Well, the biggest thing that we've seen within regulated industries such as financial services and the pharmaceutical industry and the medical device industry is that companies have a substantial concern about compliance and compliance violations. And if you take a look at this slide that I'm showing right now, you get an example of some of the different concerns that companies have seen if you read the news or if you've been part of this experience. There's some recent, was a recent New York Times article about the fact that the New York Police Department as an organization had imposed specific rules and concerns around the use of social media. Recently, the SEC has provided guidance for organizations in terms of how they adopt public social media. And educational institutions have announced that they would encourage the use of social media and communication internally, but that they would also undertake a continuous monitoring of that social media activity because of concerns about student conduct and bullying and the like. You've also seen recent organizations and regulatory bodies such as the PAAB in Canada have announced specific expectations for either industries or individual or the economy in general in terms of expectations about how people should conduct social business both on an internal and an external basis. So where that leaves us with is we've got this opportunity that stands in front of us that's tremendously valuable, but people are really hindered because there's so many different compliance compliance concerns that are out there that are hindering adoption. Now, to try to break this down, let's take a look first at some survey data from Forrester. And this talks about how companies think about social risk and the different categories of risk. So this is from 2012, and it's some survey data of executives and organizations in terms of when you adopt a social platform, what are you most concerned about? And you can see that the concerns are significant in 3 different categories, both data leaks and intellectual privacy leakage, inappropriate conduct that's going to create issues, and regulatory challenges. And so I guess the big takeaway from all of this is the compliance concerns that companies have aren't just in a single narrow category that can easily get your hands around, but the concerns are multiple faceted and often also industry dependent. So to break down those concerns, one of the first things that we do as an organization and that we've seen the best customers do in the organization is to take that diffuse policy concern that's out there and break it up into individual categories. And we provided a categorization scheme here on the page into 4 different buckets that seem to be the primary concerns about organizations as they adopt internal social platforms. The first harkens back to that Forrester survey, the concept of disclosure and data loss prevention. The second one is also tied to, is also something that's echoed in the Forrester data, the concept of employee conduct and how, if I adopt an internal social platform, what can I do to either prevent or respond to inappropriate employee conduct? The third area that we advise customers to think about, and the third area of priority we've seen in customers adopting internal social platforms, is the recognition privacy concerns. This is one that's both in terms of the members of the network, held in terms of the members of the network who are participating in the social activity, as well as the organization. There's been a number of recent court rulings which suggest that companies have an obligation to monitor social activity, but they need to do so in a way which is very transparent and open with the employees who participate in the network. So balancing the privacy needs of the individual needs to be a major compliance consideration and a major bucket, if you will, for folks who are taking on the compliance challenges associated with adopting an internal social platform. And the last area that we see companies focus on are specific regulatory areas. And we'll get into some detail about this in a few minutes. But you can think about this as both federal regulations, regional regulations, state regulations, as well as industry-specific regulations that an organization is facing. Well, where does this leave an organization in terms of thinking about taking on an internal social platform? Well, one of the first things that we see is that some companies never get beyond the consideration of adopting an internal social platform because they come to the recognition, which is absolutely a true recognition, which is it is absolutely impossible to control the entirety of the sense of all the enterprise social risks. We actually call this image the wall of pain, if you will. There's an incredible opportunity out there for organizations, but it comes with risk, and it is absolutely impossible to eliminate all of the risk that's out there. The adoption of a internal social platform really needs to be taken hand in hand with the recognition that you can't control everything. But it is our contention today, and what we'll talk about in terms of our practical suggestions, that you can control enough of it so that any industry can make beneficial use of internal social within their organization. So we wanted to start, as we talk about how you'd solve the problem, by drawing an analogy. We think very much about the transformation of social business as analogous to companies' adoptions of internet and network computing in the early turn of the century, 15 plus years ago, so to speak. And if you think about the way that the interconnections of computers and the risks that were represented by those interconnections was addressed, there was an entire industry that emerged that provided antivirus protection for organizations. And overnight, in a manner of speaking, companies that really felt like they needed to have a wall around their entire corporate infrastructure could connect to one another and achieve the business benefits associated with that. We're in the same kind of circumstance right now associated with the transformation for social computing. Social represents a new way to connect individual organizations together, but also individuals within an organization. And the best analogy that we've been able to come up with for how to manage the risks that are created through those greater interconnections is to go back to that comparison of the antivirus software. And so if you think about how you as a professional could take on the concept of social risk within your organization when you adopt an internal social platform, think about how antivirus software attacks that problem for network computing. You've got a couple of examples here on the page. The first of it is think about the fact that there are many types of risks and that there are signatures of those risks that companies can look for to identify and respond to in the marketplace. The second concept that harkens back to antivirus that is also applicable to social is you can think about the concept of social compliance as part of your infrastructure, not as a new interface for companies. We'll get to this in a few minutes, but it's our belief that companies will continue to want to use their social platform of choice, and the way to ensure compliance and risk management is not to provide a new interface, but instead to provide infrastructure-like solutions for them. Infrastructure solutions that I might add plug into operating environments. Now, you can extend this antivirus analogy even further when you think about what do you do to respond to threats and take action. Well, in the antivirus world, threats are responded to by the removal of code, by the quarantining of suspicious messages that may create a risk, and by the maintenance of an ongoing audit trail that can be used as a means of identifying future risk. Those same types of processes and needs also emerge when you think about the intersection of social and compliance. So what are some practical steps that organizations who are thinking about adopting internal social platforms or who are looking to take a pilot that they may have underway with internal social to an enterprise level but are worried about compliance, what are some practical aspects that companies can keep in mind when doing that so that they can mitigate their risk and control for their compliance? Well, we've got 4 basic suggestions that we make to organizations that they need to make sure that they cover their bases when they're adopting an internal social platform so that they're prepared for current and future compliance risks. The first stipulation that we make is the concept of collecting and archiving social feeds. We'll go into that in a few moments, but the first thing is to think about this as another type of electronic communication, and there are needs to collect and store information for future reference, even if you don't know what the compliance risk is now, but you may have an emerging risk in the future. So the first step is, can you make sure that you can collect it and store it? The second suggestion that we make to organizations is, as you think about social, it represents a much more immediate and transparent means of communications within an organization. And as a result of that, you need to adopt a stance where you are thinking about the individual policies that you're looking to enforce associated with the social dialogue that's taking place. So do you have a means to understand the policies you're looking to enforce and a means to identify within the social dialogue that's taking place how are those policies potentially going to be violated? So that kind of policy by policy approach is the second priority that companies need to think about when they're adopting, when they're thinking about risk management for internal social. The third recommendation that we make to companies is that when you think about social, there's often an incredible amount of attention that's paid to the posts and comments that are shared back and forth within a social platform or a collaboration platform. But one of the greatest risks that are out there for organizations is not the sharing of posts and comments, but the files that get shared back and forth. And so an organization that's thinking about adopting internal social needs to think about how they control and manage the distribution of the content and files that are associated with social. And then the last step here, or recommendation, a practical recommendation we make to companies, ties back to that concept of policy analysis, which is Once I identify those potential, as an organization, just like any good compliance program, you need to have a plan associated with how are you either going to prevent, respond, or remediate to the possible violations that occur when individuals are chattering or yammering or connecting back and forth. So to break down each of these individual practical pieces into some advice, let me first look at some timeline considerations. So we'll break down the advice into, first of all, before you begin, the stage when you're setting up your system for the first time, some specific considerations for each of those 4 areas at launch, and then finally some considerations for how you as an organization plan for growing for success. And one of the things that I want to add to this is, if you think about managing for social compliance over the course of a process, launching an internal social platform is not a trivial technology undertaking. It can often take weeks or months in terms of how long an organization commits to it in terms of the change management and the like that goes on. But that the best thing about social compliance is that social compliance can often is not a limiting factor for companies as they move from one gate, from one stage to the other. Our experience has been that setting up to meet the compliance needs of an organization is really a matter of hours or days as an organization goes to an enterprise rollout. So it doesn't have to take away from the broader timeline that companies undertake when they're adopting internal social platforms. So let's talk first about before you begin. So what are some practical advice that we would give to organizations who are thinking about adopting internal social platforms and are worried about compliance? Well, the first thing that we would tell you, have to believe in the power of the social business transformation. One of the biggest indicators of future failure associated with the adoption of an internal social platform is when the people who are ultimately implementing are not believing that it will fundamentally change the way that they do business. So we would first tell you that if, as an organization, you don't believe that you have enough believers, it's probably not the right time to adopt an internal social platform. The second piece of advice that we give to companies is, before you begin, make sure that you have executive buy-in for a social business transformation and an executive awareness of the compliance concerns that may come about as a result of that transformation. Again, our experience has been that if you don't have executives who are truly bought into the idea of they themselves becoming social, you as an organization will truly make that social transformation and get those benefits associated with it. The third area gets more specific around the concept of compliance concerns. One of the best pieces of advice we give to organizations is, because the compliance concern is so diffuse within an organization, you often need to think about how do you break it down into the individual functional groups. So as you think about the before you begin process, you need to meet with the individual functional parts of your organization and understand both what are all of their compliance concerns that they have that may come about if you start chattering or yammering and the like. And then of those compliance concerns, which ones are the actual priorities? And we'll get back to it in a minute. Knowing the priorities can be a great assistance as you configure your social compliance program, because some of your priorities you want to act on in a proactive basis, whereas other compliance concerns you might be willing to act on in a reactive basis for the sake, again, of fostering true social interaction. And then the last suggestion that we make to organizations is, we believe that any enterprise that takes on an internal social platform also takes on a responsibility for moderating and monitoring that dialogue that takes place. And so before you begin the whole process, you must have commitment from executives and key functional characters within your organization who truly understand and appreciate the fact that while we're creating an open dialogue and a greater level of transparency, we're also making a commitment to maintaining the quality and the compliance of that dialogue. So let's talk about the first of the 4 areas associated with some practical advice. Let's talk about collecting and archiving social feeds and the considerations for setup, for launch, and for growth. Now, when a company thinks about adopting an internal social platform, the first step that we also recommend when they're getting into the setup phase is you've got to make sure that you identify all of the social channels, internal social channels that you're adopting as an organization, and ensure that you're prepared to archive each of those individual social channels. What does that mean? Well, as an organization, you might adopt 20, or you might have 20 or 30 or 40 different instances of chatter. And so as an organization who is looking to collect and archive all of that activity for future e-discovery and for monitoring and compliance needs, you need to make sure that you know all of those internal social platforms that are out there as an organization that may be piloted that are going to be subject to compliance. The second consideration for organizations is that you need to address your retention policy. How are you as an organization going to make sure that you're holding on to all electronic communications, just like any other electronic communication that takes place in social, for the period of time so that it's available for potential future litigations or risk management needs? And that's the final consideration, which is as you think about collecting and archiving, you need to plan in advance for what you anticipate your future e-discovery needs will be for your internal social platform and the dialogue that takes place with it. At launch, the greatest priority we point customers to is to think about how, when you launch, you are addressing the privacy needs of your users. And what we're typically suggesting to organizations is that when they launch, they're incorporating into their launch an attestation or an understanding from the individual users that they're participating in a monitored forum, and that those individuals have acknowledged that their posts and comments will be monitored or can be subject to discovery. And then the last advice that we give to companies as they think about collecting and archiving social feeds from a social compliance perspective is, how do you prepare for additional feeds in the future? Companies simply don't stop their social transformation with a single chatter deployment. Companies don't stop with a single choice of platform. They typically have many, many different ways for collaboration that they're undertaking internally. And as an individual who's trying to get on top of those compliance challenges, you need to do that with an eye towards the fact that it's not about, again, one platform, but many platforms that will proliferate in the coming years. Let's talk about the second area, which is policy. Now, policy is probably the greatest challenge that an organization needs to wrestle with as they think about adopting an internal social platform. You really need to understand as an organization what are the policy violations that you're concerned are going to transpire, and what as an organization do you need to respond to those policy violations. What I've highlighted on the page here, because we have a focus for today on life sciences, are some of the policies that we've worked with companies and have understood are big concerns that they have when adopting an internal social platform. They're worried about posts and comments that could be construed or could create liability associated with the Anti-Kickback Act. They're concerned about the sharing of information within an internal social platform that might represent a violation of privacy via sharing of personalized health information. They're concerned about the sharing of information and what it might represent in terms of the loss of intellectual property or trade secrets that go somewhere in the organization before they're prepared to do so, or go even outside of the organization. And then they're also concerned about how the adoption of an internal social platform might create future e-discovery concerns in areas like off-label promotion and illegal promotion. So one of the first pieces of suggestions for organizations as they think about adopting a social platform is, again, understand those policies that you as an organization are most concerned about. And secondly, make sure that you engage the stakeholders who are concerned about that policy. And I've drawn one of those comparisons here on this slide. If you think about employee conduct, you're typically going to want to engage people within the HR function and understand from them what are the kind of events that or risks that they're concerned about when adopting an internal social platform, and how would they need to be notified when those risk events take place, and would they want to be able to respond. Some other considerations for policies from setup, launch, and growth. The first setup consideration for companies beyond identifying the policies is identify what are the signatures of the policy violations that they're looking for. OpenQ provides a solution called OpenQ Safeguard, which includes a library of possible violation signatures out of the box. But our experience has always been that no matter what library we provide, the customer always has incremental risks and signatures that stem from them that they'll be looking to add to their compliance monitoring system. The second consideration associated with setup is to accommodate group differences on policies. Many social platforms, such as IBM Connections, have means by which you're not just deploying a single transparent community across an enterprise, but might have individual groups. Within the pharmaceutical industry, you could think about sales as a community. You could think about marketing as a community. You could think about development as a community. And as an organization, you need to understand, are there policy differences in terms of how the dialogue can take place within sales that would be different from development? Our experience in life sciences is that the nature of policy priorities between those two functional groups can sometimes be substantial. A third consideration on setup is that you need to plan for the insights that you're looking to garner from these social activities and the compliance and predictive risks that may accrue in advance. So know how you're going to report out to organizations about the health and compliance of your social network on an ongoing basis. At launch, you need to make sure that your policy considerations and the policy education is part of your training and your onboarding, and that from day one, policy adherence is reinforced by your community owners who are going to be out there participating in the social community, and in addition to compliance enforcement, which may take place utilizing technology, are going to reinforce compliance to company policies via informal dialogue or formal posts on the system. And then our final piece of practical advice for the growth for the future is that companies need to anticipate that they'll make policy adjustments and have new policy needs over time. If you're a member of the life sciences industry and you do business within the United States, which is everyone, you are anticipating that there will be additional FDA-driven guidelines for social media that will come about in 2014. That's just one of many trends that we anticipate will continue to develop. So no matter what policies you put in place on day one, you need to anticipate that those policies are going to change and need to be adjusted over time. Let's go to the third area, which is the control and distribution of social content. This is one of the compliance considerations that often gets overlooked by organizations as they adopt internal social platforms. They will often, again, focus on the sharing of the individual content, comments and posts, and often forget about the considerations associated with the sharing of files. So some of the considerations that we suggest companies undertake at setup, launch, and growth include be aware and establish up front what sort of content can be shared within the organization. When we deploy with customers, we often have explicit discussions about the nature of what's the content that could be shared within the system. Is it PowerPoint files? Is it Excel files? What type of information can be viewed as acceptable in that information that's shared at the same time? And again, this ties back to the concept of business purpose. So think about what kind of content you want to allow to be shared within the system. The next consideration is who are the authors associated with that content. We've worked with organizations that will allow everyone to have posts, comments back and forth, but they'll identify only specific individuals who can submit and contribute content that's shared within that social network. And then the last consideration for setup is that many social platforms also have a mobile component to their actions, and that file content in a mobile environment has a tremendous risk for being shared outside of an organization. So when you think about adopting a social platform and the files sharing that may take place back and forth, make sure that you understand what are the implications on a mobile front, and are you as an organization comfortable with the level of file sharing that might take place if a file or PowerPoint, for example, gets onto a mobile device. As you move to the launch phase, you need to think about the concept of controlling the distribution of social content by establishing certain norms or precedents ahead of time. Identify the thought leaders who are going to be participating in your social networks internally, and make sure that they're contributing appropriate content from day one so that they're setting the examples for others over time. And then while you're in the growth phase of your internal social platform to ensure compliance in the area of content, we suggest that companies build in the anticipation that they'll adjust what type of content and business purpose of that content that they will allow in their social network over time. Let's jump to the final area, which is taking action. One of the biggest distinctions between email and social as a means of electronic communication, and there are many other differences, but one of them is because it's such an immediate medium, companies really need to think about their compliance programs, not in terms of response after the fact, but in the ability to prevent or take immediate action and to deliberately and in a proactive way, if possible, remediate for any violations that take place. So if you're thinking about technology solutions for social compliance, we would advise you to think very carefully about, do you have the actions available within the solution that you select that allow you, if a violation takes place, to take proactive and decisive action by doing things like automatically quarantining messages, by allowing, if required, for pre-post review of content, by enabling after-the-fact remediation and legal holds. So as you think about your deployment, make sure that you've got a very active dialogue, if you will, about the idea of taking action. So what are some considerations in the setup, the launch, and the growth phase? Well, during the setup phase, we advise that companies need to think about from the beginning, how do I plan on routing violations that take place? What is the actual content for the communications that I'm going to undertake when those violations take place? So in other words, have your playbook for every type of violation, all the specific messages you're going to be communicating, set up and isolated up front. If somebody posts an off-label comment in a forum where off-label comments are not considered acceptable, what does the organization need to do? What gets communicated to that individual? What gets communicated to that forum? At launch phase, in terms of taking action, we advise that companies think deeply about how do you respond in what we would call a blue ribbon way to that first violation, to both the user and the community. Dialogue, often you'll see that in the initial days of a adoption of an internal social platform, people will do things like testing dialogue, and the success of a future growth of a platform will really be reliant on encouraging dialogue, but at the same time enforcing the norms that you expect associated with it. So the right response to those initial possible violations will really set the tone for successful expansion of your social dialogue. And then over time, as you grow your social platform, we suggest that you think deeply about how you make sure that you adjust your actions. And what we mean there is you can think about certain policies where you want to be able to prevent posts. There are other policies where you want to automatically remove a post that gets submitted or a file that gets submitted, and other policies where you want to be able to be notified if someone posts something that, for example, includes offensive or inappropriate language, but you'd want to respond to that on a reactive basis. So think about the actions that you'll take and understand that over time you may very well shift in terms of what you're trying to prevent what you're trying to immediately respond to or what you're trying to respond to reactively. So I want to close the presentation today by talking about 3 trends associated with the future. So I've provided with you with some practical advice for if you're adopting an internal social platform, what are some of the priorities and what are some of the objectives that you can think about. But where are we going as a business? Where is social evolving to? And understanding that the compliance challenges for internal social are going to evolve with the marketplace itself. And there are 3 tenets that we'd like you to keep in mind as you deploy your successful solutions in the years ahead and take advantage of that mental check I had you visualize at the beginning of this presentation. The first is risks are everywhere. The second is don't get in the way of the user. And the third one is policies and action. Let's take a look at each of those individuals. What are the implications for them, and what are the implications also for internal social? Well, when you think about the concept of risks are everywhere, what we mean there is that we're still just coming to understand the ways that organizations and the mediums that companies will go social in the years ahead. You've got a couple of examples of social platforms here on the slide in between private internal communities, social media management platforms, public social platforms, and social CRM and file sharing. And the only thing that we know for sure about the future is that social will continue to grow in terms of the types of social activity that are out there, and that as an organization you need to see, you need to anticipate that there will be more and more channels, if you will, that people will be able to collaborate with. And as you adopt those new channels, you need to think about how to address them from a compliance perspective. So what's the implication for internal social? Well, in addition to the understanding that internal social platforms are going to proliferate in the coming years, you also need to understand that the wall between internal social and external social is going to entirely disappear. It's our anticipation that 4 to 5 years from now, there will no longer be a distinction between an internal social community and an external social community. It will only be a function of the type of boundaries that an organization can and is able to put in place for the sharing of certain types of information. So as you think about the launch of your internal social platform now, you really need to think about it as the beginning of a trend where the dialogue that you're having right now will start to be a dialogue that will increasingly engage greater and greater circles of the public. The second consideration is that over the next 5 years, we anticipate that adoption of social tools will be a major consideration, and that there are many, many technology companies with excellent solutions like Salesforce Chatter and Hootsuite that are really garnering attention for the eyes and attention of companies that are looking to transform themselves into social businesses. They're investing an incredible amount in creating excellent user interfaces for companies and individuals to use in the years ahead. What's the implication for an organization thinking about social compliance? If you are adopting a social compliance, if you are worried about social compliance, it is our recommendation that over the next 5 years, you really need to think about the fact that social compliance cannot create a new interface for how individuals conduct their social activity. It really needs to operate in a transparent and behind-the-scenes way. What you see here on the slide is the fact that at OpenQ we adopt what we call an app-centric approach, which is ultimately connect to the networks that the company needs to use to be social, but to fundamentally allow individuals within an organization to use their social network or SNM of choice to conduct business. It's our belief that this imperative to not get in the way of the user will be important over the coming years, even more over the coming years. So what's the implication for internal social of this second rule over the next 5 years? It's our belief that social on an internal basis, even as the walls come down, as I stated previously, need to be as transparent as possible, need to be as less intrusive with the user from a compliance perspective, and also need to maintain a vigilant approach towards respecting the privacy wherever possible of the user, or to be very explicit about what's the level of privacy that the individual can expect. The third major trend that we anticipate over the next few years is that the concept of looking at the compliance challenge from a policy level and an action-oriented approach will persist in the coming years. And what we mean there is companies will have to think about not just compliance as this large amorphous concern, but really break it down into the individual policies that they're concerned about, and that that responding to compliance and possible risks really needs to be something that's thought of not just as a reactive or a monitoring or an after the fact, but that increasingly companies will be expected to take proactive or immediate action if a risk event occur. Now, what's the implication of this for organizations that are looking to have their internal social? They really need to think about how their social, their future is if you will, identified and blueprinted out from both a policy perspective and how those policies can change over time, and what are the policy priorities that a company is looking to enforce, and what are those actions that a company needs to undertake whenever they're conducting social business. Do they need to have the ability to automatically remove messages? Do they need the ability to not just maintain an audit trail of all the messages, but of all the activities and responses to those messages, to any remediation activity that they need to undertake? It's our belief that companies who are going to be the most successful on the social realm in the coming years will be companies that recognize these three trends and respond to them accordingly. That's the last guidance that we have in terms of our webinar today. I'm going to pause at this point for any questions. I also want to highlight the fact that OpenQ as an organization, as I mentioned, is deeply committed to social compliance. We maintain a library of white papers and thought pieces and blogs around different considerations and issues in social compliance on our website, www.openq.com. We also look for other content that's out there in the social world that we can point to at the same time. If you're interested in learning more, we advise you to review our Social Compliance Handbook, which is available on our site, to join the Social Media Compliance Council forum that we are part of on LinkedIn. You can look that up by typing in Social Media Compliance Council. And if you're interested in learning more, contact us to obtain a briefing or to conduct a free trial. With that, I'll pause here and ask if there are any additional questions.